I'm Cierra Bettens. This is APTN News InFocus. On this episode, to trade with the United States or not to trade with the United States.
For decades, Canada's economy became more closely linked to the United States. The U.S. is the world's largest economy, so on the one hand, that created tons of new business and jobs for us. But it also meant that when things change suddenly for the worse down there, it causes big problems up here, and it's hard to control what happens next. As Prime Minister, my number one focus is to put Canadians back in control by building here at home and building new partnerships abroad, so that we're not reliant on the United States. To do that, we will have to make some...
That was a message from Prime Minister Mark Carney. It's from November 2025, but it's still pinned to the top of his X page with the caption, "This is our country, and we decide what happens next." Since then, the federal government says it's signed billions in trade deals with other nations. And while the Prime Minister isn't hiding the difficulties in working with the current U.S. administration, he doesn't seem to be giving up on it either. Last week, Carney announced a revamped Economic Advisory Council to make recommendations on Canada-U.S. economic relations. There are a number of new faces on the panel, including former Conservative MPs Lisa Raitt and Aaron O'Toole, and former Liberal Cabinet Minister Ralph Goodale. Former Nunavut Premier PJ Akiagok has also been added to that list. So there are only 4 returning members of the Advisory Council, and Tabatha Bull is one of them. She's the president of the Canadian Council for Indigenous Business, and she joins me now with more. Tabatha, thanks so much for being here.
Thanks for having me.
So, as I mentioned, you're one of only 4 people returning to the Advisory Committee on Canada-U.S. Economic Relations. How will this panel be different?
A few ways. I think we are very much closer to the KUSMA renegotiation, so a little bit more, tangible conversations with respect to KUSMA or USMCA negotiation, but also just looking around the table, we do see a different representation. It's really great to have Arctic representation there with PJ. I think that's really important as we look to security and defense spending and where we're going. But also to have Honorable Janice Charette, who is our chief negotiator, and Dominic LeBlanc. I think that, we're really getting to where we might see the relations for Canada-US, not just with KUSMA, but also just moving forward in a changing relationship.
So you recently had your first meeting, and I'm wondering, what was the sort of overall message from that meeting?
Being the first meeting, of course, it was a bit of where are things now, how are conversations going, and also, a conversation about what do we as representatives around the table hope or think is a good outcome from both the negotiations and also thinking moving forward as a country who's also looking to diversify our trading partners, but how do we, find some type of reliability for business, I think, in this ever-changing state of play that we're in.
Mm-hmm. And so the challenge at hand is to renew the Canada-US-Mexico trade agreement, commonly known as KUSMA. Can you explain to us what that agreement is?
The trade agreement between Canada, US, and Mexico, which, back early when I started in this role was when we were first having conversations around that, so 2020. And now we're at a point of the KUSMA review, which is really a review and a renewal, not meant to be a time of renegotiation. And if we can come to an agreement, then the KUSMA will continue on. If not, we will enter into a period of renewal conversations. So I think it's very interesting that it is a conversation about, can we get to a consensus to continue KUSMA? And if not, then this review will start, but KUSMA will still stay in place while those reviews happen. And I think that's an important piece to note. When we first were, as CCIB, speaking on KUSMA back before it was signed, and there were other people at the table of that negotiation, specifically AFN was there. There was a real push to have an Indigenous chapter specifically within the trade agreement. We weren't able to get there, but there are specific clauses that are important and specifically speak to Indigenous people and Indigenous business. We had hoped that we would be in this place and be able to push for more within those clauses. I don't think we're there with the administration that's in the US at this point. So we are really looking at ensuring that we can preserve some of those clauses.
So, Prime Minister Mark Carney has said that he wants to secure a quote, strong economic partnership with the United States that creates greater certainty, security, and prosperity for all, unquote. And I'm wondering, how do you think we get there?
I think, we talked about this on Monday, but we've talked about this with our members as well. I think everybody's looking for stability and certainty. I think KUSMA will be able, if we can get to a point of agreement on that, it will give us some, but I think with the administration in the US right now, getting to certainty or stability is going to be difficult. So I think another piece of this conversation is going to have to be how are we providing that within what we can do here in Canada and with potentially new trade partners and supports for business here in Canada. I mean, we've seen other countries that have signed agreements with the US early, and they're still in a period of uncertainty and um, not quite the stability that they had been hoping for. So I think we all need to really be cognizant that that is the administration that exists today in the US. And as part of this council, there also needs to be a discussion about how can we support business here in Canada, both through nation building projects that have been such a conversation, but also new trade agreements as well, just to protect against that uncertainty.
So you touched on this a bit before, mentioning the hopes of having an Indigenous chapter in the trade agreement. But I'm wondering, how do Indigenous peoples and Indigenous-owned businesses sort of fit into this agreement?
So within the existing agreement, there is Chapter 13, for example, which talks about government procurement set aside specifically for underrepresented groups, which Indigenous business is currently included within there. We want to ensure that that remains. We've seen a move away from government procurement set asides in the US for Native American businesses there, but we want to ensure that that exception is allowed to remain, specifically as we look at defense spending here in Canada, the 5% minimum target that still exists from Indigenous business federally here in Canada. So that is a key piece that we want to make sure remains. There's also a chapter with respect to small and medium enterprises, and Indigenous businesses are, over 98% small, medium enterprises. And we've seen out of stats from Canadian Federation of Independent Business and also our surveys that small, medium enterprises are really suffering right now. So we want to ensure that we can keep that chapter. That chapter had talked about developing new programs to support small and medium enterprises and specifically Indigenous businesses within that as well. That's one of the areas where we had hoped to move further in this KUSMA negotiation, but at this point, really wanting to just preserve that conversation. And then, of course, a general exception that is within the agreement that protects Indigenous rights and agreements. And that is a key part of KUSMA that we want to ensure remains as well.
So when we've discussed Canada-US trade relations in the past on this podcast, there's been, some mention of the Jay Treaty. And I'm wondering from your perspective, how does that factor into Indigenous business relations across borders?
I think it is something that I have raised with the committee as well, both in mobility of us as Indigenous people across the border, but also, the ability for us to trade. I mean, that hasn't been respected from Canada's perspective to date. It's been more respected from the US perspective. Um, Truly, I'm a little hesitant to rely on that with the current administration in the US and their movement away from respecting the rights of Native Americans there. I think it's more, we may have a stronger position in reflecting that the border, we were here long before the border was, and uh, we need to push for safety of people to be able to travel safely, particularly in so many communities where they have members living on both sides of the border, both here in southern Canada, but also Alaska and the territories. We know that there are relatives that live on both sides of the borders, and that will be a conversation that we'll be having. I think from an economic perspective, we will be talking about trade at this committee, but I am committed to continue to raise that as a reminder, and that those conversations need to continue to happen with um, AFN and those people that are having those conversations in Ottawa right now as well.
And you've also touched on this, but speaking as a member of the advisory council, how do you feel Canada should face the challenges of dealing what, really seems to be an erratic trading partner?
Yeah, I think, there's still work that we can do here within Canada. And definitely, we see Indigenous exporters do demonstrate a strong orientation towards the US market. It is the highest percentage of where Indigenous businesses do export. But within Canada, there are still barriers for Indigenous business and all business to be able to trade interprovincially. And I know we made some real progress on that over the last couple of years, but there are still some work to be done in that area. And I think that that's a real opportunity that we can um, support to, not just diversify with other countries, but diversify within our own country. And I think that will open new opportunities. Also, as we think to diversifying in other markets, we've done some recent, have some recent reports, our Dawe report, the looking at the opportunity for Indigenous businesses to export outside of Canada. There is definitely an increased interest and also an increased interest from other countries. So I've had the opportunity to travel most recently to the UK, talking at an Indigenous investment summit there. And there is a keen interest from other countries in working with Indigenous business. And I think so much of interesting piece of that is that investors are also looking for projects and businesses that do follow environmental guidelines and sustainable guidelines and have good governance. And Indigenous businesses really have that at their core, and Indigenous projects have that at their core. So I think that is something that is an opportunity for us to ensure that people around the globe are aware of the benefit of working with Indigenous business and Indigenous community projects.
Hmm. So as I mentioned before, you're one of 4 returning members to this advisory council. So with this mostly new advisory council, will the issues or topics that are being discussed change at all?
I don't think I am not getting that sense just from our first meeting. I think it is a really good representation of business and union representation and across different sectors. Um, there has been conversations at sectoral tables as well, is my understanding, outside of this committee. But in hearing from the first meeting and the people around the table, the conversation and the issues and the pain points that Canadians and businesses are feeling are very similar. I think one benefit that I have found both from the previous council and this council is also the opportunity for us as CCIB to bring to everybody else on the council the issues faced by Indigenous business, and just to continue to raise awareness about Indigenous business in this country with the leaders around the table. And I found in the first council that allowed us to build strong voices to advocate at other tables for Indigenous business and Indigenous projects. And I think just the learning around the table from peers and the sharing around the table is even a big benefit, both to us and I think to all Canadians and everyone um, there at the table. And the other piece that's important is for us as committee members to think about our partners in the US and our colleagues and peers in the US, and how can we ensure that they understand that KUSMA and USMCA is a good deal, and how can we leverage those relationships for them to advocate to their constituents as well.
And what are you hearing more directly from Indigenous business owners and leaders about how Canada-US trade relations have been impacting them?
Yeah, so we will be putting a survey out into market in a couple of weeks, specifically to hear more targeted answers to some of those questions. But this definitely, the uncertainty has been very difficult for all businesses, and for many Indigenous businesses here in Canada, they've chosen either to stop shipping to the US just because of the cost of both the cost of the tariffs, but also increased difficulty with some of the de minimis exemptions just in processing um, for those exemptions that currently exist within KUSMA. And also, being able to, where can you fit in that additional cost that the tariffs are putting on a small business? There's a difficulty in passing that on to your consumer. So some businesses have chosen to stop shipping to the US. Some have also, tried to continue to educate the buyer and why costs are increasing. But it has definitely been a bit of a pullback from trading in that space. We also had some members who were had business plans in order to enter the U.S. market prior uh, to this situation arising, and they've abandoned those for now. But I think it's more about, it is a bit of a pause until there's a better understanding, in order to build a stronger business case and have a bit more certainty on where their pricing will land and how to work with consumers in the US.
So another member of this council is former Nunavut Premier PJ Akiagok, who's also on the panel. Have you worked with him before?
No, we've definitely, been at similar conferences and had conversations before. I was really pleased to see him on this committee as well, and we've had some good conversations and about how we can, work together and ensure that we're advocating and supporting one another. Um, I was pleased to see him there, both to have another Indigenous representative at the committee, but also the conversation around the Arctic and specifically now is often a conversation that gets missed, and that representation has often been missed in these tables. So I think his perspective will be very valuable both for the committee, but also as we think about defense in the Arctic and the additional projects that are happening, that have been announced under nation building. To have his voice there will be really important.
So the US is now demanding an entry fee to get into talks with the US, something that Canada said isn't going to happen. Do you see talks starting anytime soon?
So that, my understanding from the council is that conversations are happening at high senior levels currently. I think, we've seen the Prime Minister and Minister LeBlanc say, we don't necessarily want to negotiate on the front page of the newspaper. And I have to agree with that. Officially, talks are to start July 1st, as that's, part of the KUSMA review. But my understanding is that there are frequent conversations happening already.
Tabatha, before I let you go, I wanted to kind of know, what are some core goals or visions that you hope are ultimately forwarded through this council?
I think, firstly, I do feel that it is very important that this council exists and that this government is looking to leaders, business leaders, union leaders, Indigenous people, for input into how what is happening in the US is affecting Canadians. Um, and also, as we think about this, is our neighbor, and we have had good relations in the past, and how can we hope to preserve the relationship under the current administration, but also if we're going forward, as two countries who have relied on each other, who have neighbors and family members crossing the border or on both sides of the border. Our students travel and study on both sides of the border. So I think as Canadians, we are also wanting to understand how we can ensure that this is a good relationship moving forward. And I feel that it says a lot to bring a group of people together and for us to have an opportunity to input into policy and into negotiations, and for people in Ottawa to really understand what we're hearing on the ground. As a representative of Canadian Council for Indigenous Business, it's a true honor for me, and I hold it with a lot of weight that we don't often get a voice at these tables, and having an opportunity to be there and speak about Indigenous business is something that I'm very proud of and will work very hard to ensure that our voices are heard.
Well, Tabatha, thank you so much again for making the time today. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Tabatha Bull is the president of the Canadian Council for Indigenous Business and a member of the Advisory Committee on Canada-US Economic Relations. This episode of InFocus was produced by Mark Blackburn and edited by Jesse Andrushko. Charmaine Straker is the executive producer of APTN News InFocus. We want to know if you're enjoying the show. Please leave a rating and review on your favorite player, or email your suggestions to infocus@aptn.ca. I'm Cierra Bettens. Thanks for listening. Talk to you next week.
What is Indian status in Canada, and what can it be used for? We see a lot of comments online about how First Nations people can use their status to get things like tax exemptions, free housing, free education, and more. But what's the truth about status and the reality of these so-called free aspects? I'm Savannah Kelly. Join me and my co-host Jesse Andrushko on APTN News Answers, a new series where we shed light on topics related to current events and issues facing Indigenous people. Watch now on the APTN News YouTube channel.